Hi, everyone, and welcome to our monthly webinar, the SharePoint Maturity Journey, where we will explore the path towards better collaboration and productivity through the various stages of SharePoint maturity. I'm Andreas Abi Khalil, Partner and Program Manager at Appio Solution, and your moderator for the day. Before I hand you to today's presenter, I would like to mention our rules of engagement for this webinar. This webinar is recorded and will be available on demand. If needed, please reach out to your partner or direct contact on the team to gain access to it. For questions, please leverage the Q&A feature in your top toolbar. We will dedicate time at the end of this webinar to answer them. Our featured speaker for today's webinar is Joseph Calaf, the president of Appio Solution. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and thank you for everybody that's attending this webinar today. I will go ahead and share my screen, and we will start with our presentation. So today's webinar is going to focus on SharePoint maturity and how do we identify the stages of SharePoint maturity, and as an organization, how do we get to the next step, and what does it mean to get to the next step of a SharePoint maturity journey. The idea behind this webinar is, as a Microsoft partner who does quite a bit of SharePoint work for a lot of our customers, we have learned over the years that there is nothing wrong with being in any one of these stages, as long as we, as an organization, identify the next stage to get to. And as organizations grow, you will move from one stage to the next, and sometimes not in a forward fashion, meaning as organizations grow, as companies grow, and more organizations are introduced into companies, a lot of companies learn that you actually sometimes move backwards and have to reset and refocus on how to move forward. The stage you are as an organization when it comes to SharePoint maturity is really dependent on a lot of things. And again, as I mentioned, there is really no I'm in the wrong place. There is only the I am cognizant and aware of the fact that I need to be in a different place or in a better place when it comes to SharePoint. It's an ever-evolving journey. And how do we understand where we're at? Why do we think we're in certain places? A lot of times these are things that are out of any one organization or individual's control, right? And I'm showing this just to kind of make people feel at ease a little bit, even if you are sometimes a decision maker, an IT decision maker, or even more than an IT decision maker. There are different forces that are going to keep you or maybe slow you down and moving to the next stage. What are those challenges? Obviously, budgets. You know, as IT, we live and die by budgets. We know that we're not the ones that are always controlling the budgets. Moving across maturity levels requires budgets, requires resources. Sometimes there are resource constraints, whether I am an IT decision maker that has the ability to move resources around, but I can't because of other priorities. Business expectations. What are the various organizations within my company expecting out of a platform? In this case, we're talking about SharePoint, but while we believe that SharePoint could be quite a bit for a lot of organizations, it's definitely not the be-all, end-all. So there are business expectations from various organizations within a corporation or a company where we identify as IT that SharePoint is just not going to meet their needs. What are other challenges? Legacy. The term legacy, not only does it apply to systems, but it also applies to, and I don't want to say that legacy applies to people, but it applies to habits. People that are, we're habitual human beings, and when we get used to doing things certain ways, specifically when it comes to complex things like technology, when we get comfortable with those certain ways, we want to kind of hold on to our systems and hold on to the way we do things. So systems push back on us, and the reason systems push back on us is because people that are using those systems push back on us. The same as goes for legacy processes. We're used to doing certain things certain ways, and the process, we're very efficient at how we do it. And sometimes we don't stop and take a step back and go, is there a better way to do this? Is there a more automated? Should we allow technology to take away some of my work? Um, IT business partnerships, right? IT is actually just the group that is going to implement the technology, but SharePoint and any other technology for that matter is really driven by what the business needs. That partnership is important to help us move to the next stage of maturity. Um, Data, SharePoint obviously will do well with data from anywhere, but it's more complex if our data is not living in SharePoint. And when I say more complex, meaning it requires more planning, more thinking, more processes and more workflows to be able to capture and leverage and access the data that is not living in SharePoint. Finally, competing systems. SharePoint is not the only product out there. There are a lot of other software vendors and ISVs that make products that compete with SharePoint. And sometimes there are organizations that come into a company or a leader that comes into a company that is more familiar with a different system. So those competing systems sometimes hold back the maturity of SharePoint or even sometimes the implementation and the adoption of SharePoint. Um, Interoperability, we talked a little bit about that in the data set. How does SharePoint play with other products? There are, like I said, SharePoint isn't everything. So there are other systems that are very critical to a business or an organization. And the question becomes, if I'm going to implement SharePoint and I'm going to use it across a range of systems, how does it interoperate with other systems? And finally, security. Um, as we all probably know, today's push, specifically SharePoint, but that goes with any other product really, specifically with the Microsoft world. Today's push is for everything to be in the cloud. Is SharePoint online? We don't even use the term SharePoint online because SharePoint is assumed that it's online, even though there's still an on-premises version. But with the move to online, a lot of CISOs, a lot of CIOs, a lot of just directors in general are saying, am I doing everything possible to be secure and compliant? My data is living out in the cloud now. It's not a matter of I don't trust Microsoft. It's a matter of it is a cloud platform that is potentially accessible by the public. That confidence or that thinking that if I'm behind a firewall, I'm safe, but if I'm outside of the firewall, I'm no longer safe is legitimate and it has to be combated and addressed properly. So the let's look at the maturity stages, right? So maturity, obviously, the term itself kind of just speaks for what that means. It's there are benefits to being more mature. Uh, it improves collaboration, it increases productivity across the workforce, and it helps with better decision making across even low all the way to C-suite level decision makers. Right? There are 5 stages to the maturity in our model. There's the early adopter, ad hoc, chaotic. Everybody's doing whatever they want on the platform. Even though a lot of companies today think, well, I've been using SharePoint for a very long time. There's no way I'm in this chaotic ad hoc stage. That is actually not true. Um, Chaotic ad hoc stage is not the same as or does not always mean an early adopter. It could mean an adopter that has never even taken into consideration or thought through the maturity level because they believe that this is a good stage for them. They're just not aware of a better place to be. The next stage would be after a chaotic ad hoc stage would be a managed stage, which means, okay, I want to manage it. I want to be able to have some control around it, but it's not really full control and optimal control. Then you get to the standardization stage where companies and organizations start to standardize so things are seamless. Everybody understands what's right and what's wrong, what to do and what not to do, and how to do it. The controlled stage is when is a just a simple byproduct of the standardization stage, which now you've controlled the narrative. Now you've controlled how the platform is going to be used and how people are going to leverage that platform. What you do in that stage is since the controlling is a byproduct of standardization, now you a bit retroactively go back and make sure you do cleanup work so you don't end up putting yourself at a disadvantage of going back to chaos, right? So you clean up the things that the chaos stage has introduced and presented, you know, during whatever milestone or whatever duration that stage existed. And finally, you get to the optimized stage. Um, Obviously, this is where we want all our customers to be. Uh, the term speaks for itself, optimal, optimized. It's the best you could get, but that also has variance in it, right? Optimized to one corporation doesn't necessarily mean optimized to another. And the reason for that is because optimization also comes with the things that we talked about a few minutes ago on the earlier slide. It does come with financial dedication, resource commitments. You need that to stay optimal and to prove upon the optimization over time. So we're going to talk through the various stages. We're not going to go deep into each stage. We're not going to go into the technical details of each stage because there are a lot of technical details in each stage. But what we're going to cover is what does a stage look like and what does it take to, at a high level, to be in that stage. So chaotic ad hoc stage, stage one. Why would any company be in that stage? And as I mentioned, it's not necessarily early adopters, right? There are people that have been on SharePoint for years and many years, but still are in that stage. One, they never put budget towards it. It's not important. Nobody's ever evangelized the benefit of the platform. Two, maybe there is somebody in the organization or in the company that does understand the value, but cannot get their message across to the decision makers to be able to allocate resources, hire, bring in a vendor or a partner to help them move to the next stage. And what is the chaotic stage, right? Meaning everybody's running around on the platform using it as they see fit. There's no control, there's no governance, there are no standards. You're using it pretty much as a new shiny object that operates as the old rusty object. Um, what we see with a lot of companies, the common scenario is I moved away from file shares. Now all my files are in SharePoint. Great. You just moved from one storage device to another storage device. What's the difference between the two? I don't know. I have files up there and I open them. Are you leveraging the functionality and the maturity of the modernization and the innovation on the SharePoint platform? Sure, I open my files in Word and Excel. That is lack of governance, lack of maturity. You're still an ad hoc. You're using it as a newer shiny object that doesn't do anything better than the old rusty object. In that stage, because you're not leveraging all of this functionality, you're still running the business as you were years and years ago before you leveraged SharePoint. You're still duplicating efforts, or maybe in a lot of organizations, man, you're not really duplicating the effort because you don't know that the effort can be consolidated, right? This is why in this stage, you're not really taking full advantage of the platform. You're paying for something that you've always paid for, and it's not getting you to the next step. It's not helping you be more competitive. It's not helping you be more collaborative and more productive. Inefficiencies and processes, this, and we'll cover this a little bit later, but what that really means is historically with old platforms, a lot of processes were human manual driven processes. SharePoint provides the opportunity to automate a lot of these processes, to remove the human error out of these processes, to make people's jobs a lot more efficient and a lot more, make them a lot more productive. If you don't know the capabilities, if you've never invested budget or time and resources into SharePoint, you're still using inefficient old processes. You're still doing stuff like it was 1999, and you're not able to realize the full potential of the platform. And finally, we talked about SharePoint Online, which is just SharePoint, right? If you're just chaotic and you have nobody really paying close attention, you are in a security risk scenario. You are at a disadvantage from a security perspective. When we talk about security in that stage, or in any stage for that matter, Security isn't necessarily the same thing as a breach. That's not just a breach or data leak. Security could also be insider risk. In big corporations and even medium-sized corporation, mid-market corporations, security isn't just somebody outside my company looking at my data. Security is somebody inside my company looking at data they should not be looking at. This stage has become even more nefarious for a lot of companies because now a lot of companies are coming, a lot of our customers and a lot of our partners are coming to us and asking us about Copilot and about AI and about all this new, buzzwords that we hear out there, which are very valid and very important technologies. With the introduction with these additional technologies, you are putting yourself at a disadvantage, even more disadvantage being in this stage. Why? Because you're not paying attention to not only external security, you're not paying attention to internal security, to the risk that you are posing inside of the companies across various organizations within the company. So the chaotic stage, you have no governance. Everybody's running amok. Uh, People are creating whatever they want, wherever they want. They're just leveraging the platform as just a storage device for my files, for my content. Some individuals might be more mature from a technology perspective and could be leveraging the platform uh, more, but they're just doing it for their own purposes, for their own benefit, or maybe for the benefit of two or three people that are sitting around them that they collaborate with. They're not realizing the potential across the organization. Um, the most common scenario we see is sprawl. Sprawl is so common. Sprawl used to be the common scenario for early adopters, and over time we learned that that's not true. Sprawl is a common scenario for people that are always in the chaotic ad hoc stage. They just create stuff and create stuff and create stuff, and it just grows and grows and grows, and people can't find anything, and it just defeats the purpose at the end of the day. In addition, with the introductions of new technologies within the Microsoft 365 platform, we are experiencing even worse sprawl. Why? Because of the introduction of Teams. Teams leverages SharePoint as its data source, if you will, or its back end, for lack of a better term. With the introduction of Team, with the proliferation of team across all organizations. No governance means everybody gets to create a team, everybody gets to create a channel, everybody gets to put files up there. They name them whichever way they want, can't keep up with where's what, and so on and so forth. And literally, with the introduction of teams a few years ago, we have seen companies and customers move from an advanced stage backwards. Why? Because they did not pay attention to Teams. They did not pay attention to the fact that Teams is actually a bit of an extension of SharePoint. And they never had the foundational baselines and governance to be able to control that. Thus, they took a step backwards instead of a step forward. No standards. Why is that important? For a lot of customers, that might not sound like a very important thing, but for more customers that want to adhere or have to adhere by regulatory standards, there has to be some sort of a standard put in place on how users behave on the platform. But in addition, sometimes those standards have to be enforced by pushing and pulling and configuring things within or configurations within SharePoint to disallow users from breaking those standards, from breaking the rules, or from veering off of the standards. Sometimes standards might have no ramifications other than having no standards ends up keeping me in the chaotic stage, which is not really a good thing. But sometimes not having standards could put you at even a bigger disadvantage, which is I'm in a regulatory um, industry where having no standards could mean financial ramifications in the form of either, audits that cost me a lot of money or fines because I'm not adhering to standards or failing compliancy if you need to be ISO 27001 or whatever those different standards are. So it's very important that when you are in the ad hoc stage and you want to get out of that stage, you start thinking about those standards and those workflows within the platform. So the next stage we're going to talk about is the managed stage. So what is the managed? So that's really just the next step after the chaotic ad hoc stage. What does that mean? That means usually, and I want you to pay attention to the word organizations here. When we talk about organizations, we're not talking about necessarily a company. We're talking about a subset, a department within a company or an organization within a company. How do we see that move into, how do we see the most common way companies or organizations get to a managed stage is by having an organization within the company or an individual within the organization be a champion for the platform and start to actually be the enforcer of standards and of governance within SharePoint for their own organization. That is definitely a step in the right direction because now you are actually slowing down that chaotic phase. And what you're doing by having that champion, by having that technical stakeholder, you're having that individual, whomever that individual is, or you're having that organization actually lessen the burden on the whole platform because now you have a single department really adhering to standards and governance that they've created for themselves, which doesn't apply to the whole company, but at least they're no longer a cog in the system. They're not a burden on the whole platform. They are actually the if you will the bright and shining light on the hill, right? They are the model of how the rest of the company should go. That is a good place to be because that is the first step in allowing others within the company to start realizing the benefits of what this organization is doing, right? And what does it mean in the managed state they're doing? What that means is they have created a governance framework for themselves. They have created a way to control and manage their own silo, their own site, their own object, the place where they live in SharePoint. They've controlled it. It's clean. Think of it as almost a clean room in the house. The house is a mess, but the room is clean. They have been able to identify how to keep that clean and organized and well defined, and everybody that lives in that space is more efficient. They have also applied basic standards within their site or within their room. They are trained well. When we talk about a champion in an organization, it's that champion that proliferates the knowledge, that transfer their knowledge to the people around them, and they start educating those around them, their peers, on how to leverage the platform the proper way. So this is where we are in from a we are standardizing, we are governing, but we are not governing at a holistic view. It's not national governance, right? It's very siloed, individual organizational governance. It's way better than being chaotic across the board. So the next stage is standardizing. What does that mean? And here I want you to pay attention to the terms overarching, global, well-defined. Standards must apply across the board. You cannot have two standards within the same organization that compete with each other unless you separate them and you create a delineation and a well-defined line. The standardization stage means a very simple thing: basic governance across the whole tenant, meaning everybody that is a stakeholder and a user of the platform, everybody that is leveraging the platform to do their jobs must come together. And I'm not suggesting the whole company takes a day off and get together for SharePoint, but we're talking about decision makers or stakeholders or identified champions across the company from various organizations that come together and sit down and look at the global configuration of the platform and decide how it should be governed from the top down, not from the bottom up, from the top down. At the tenant level, how do we govern this? What are the policies on this platform? What are the procedures? How do we upload files? How do we use certain things? How do we share externally? How do we secure the platform? How do it's a lot of how to's and then applying the um, guardrails around how that happens afterwards, right? And finally, part of governance, which is usually not necessarily within the framework, but is an extension to the framework, is once you build that governance framework, you have to go out and educate your workforce on what is it that that committee has decided to implement, because that will affect how users use the platform. Because now users that are used to this ad hoc chaotic world that they lived in, which served their purposes really well, now there are all of a sudden um, constrained. There's constraints to what they could do, and people don't like change. If I can no longer upload exe files to my SharePoint library, I'm going to be mad because I've been doing it for 3 years. Guess what? The committee decided that this is no longer allowed because it's a security risk. I have to go educate my users. I have to go and disseminate all of this information back to my users so they can understand what the art of the possible is on the platform and what that bad behavior that they had been accustomed to is no longer allowed and why it's no longer allowed. What does the standardization bring? It's really simple. I mean, standards, while a lot of us might disagree with some standards, but standards are good, right? It brings consistency, it brings efficiency, it allows for, without standards, you cannot move to the next stage because lack of standards keeps you stuck in the mud. It keeps you stuck in an ad hoc stage. To leverage the power of the platform, which is automation and workflows and all of the other various artifacts that SharePoint and Teams and the Microsoft 365 platform provides, once you standardize, then you could start leveraging those features to automate. It allows you to be more compliant, it allows you to be more secure, and it is just, without a doubt, it's a natural progression into efficiency and productivity. So the controlled stage, right? So now that we've standardized, we've built a governance framework, we are, of course, building the framework is great, but you're going to have to go and implement the framework. Those are two different things. Even though you could, if you build the framework without implementing it, you might as well not even build the framework. Like there is a very, very meaningful phase post framework build out, which is actually literally going and implementing and enforcing whatever it is that was decided within that framework, within that governance framework. The control stage is finally actually, after implementing it, now you have controlled the platform to be used the way it should be used. You have educated your users. Now anything that's incoming and anything that is being used on the platform and all the leveraging that users do on the platform is controlled. You know what to expect. You know where to find things. You know how to address issues. You know how to control risk. All of this, you are under a tight control management. And that's not just for IT. That's for also the users of the platform. It's a controlled environment. Controlled meaning I understand my risk, right? If I know that I am not allowed to do, if my governance framework is now prohibiting me from doing something, then I understand what my risk is, or my total risk landscape is, because I know that I have to worry about A, B, and C, but I no longer have to worry about D, E, and F because that's no longer allowed, right? I also understand in a controlled environment what my compliance risk is. If I am enforcing certain things on certain documents, right? If my governance framework has dictated that there needs to be taxonomy or sensitivity labeling on my documents. Now I understand that I'm compliant to certain regulatory requirements. Retention policies, right? If I am in the financial world or in the HIPAA world, if I am in one of those two industries, there are compliance requirements that I have to adhere to. So if I am supposed to be holding on to documents for at least 7 years, and I applied the framework in my governance framework, I applied those policies to my platform, that's no longer a risk because I'm no longer allowing my users to delete files prior to the 7-year retention policy. So now I understand what my risk is, and I understand how I can stay compliant with that. So finally, we're in the optimized stage. As I mentioned at the beginning, this stage is it's a very large stage because optimization for one organization or for one company is not the same as for others. And we've seen this across the board. We go even regardless of the size of the company, even at the enterprise level or maybe at the mid-market or even small and medium businesses. We have seen companies that are so optimized in SharePoint and they are huge, and it's just really just kind of a breath of fresh air to see a company this large, a Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 company that's so optimized. But that's because they made a commitment from day one to leverage SharePoint as their almost Swiss Army knife platform, right? And then you go to other organizations that could be larger or the same size or even smaller that aren't as optimized. Why? Not because they're bad, not because they're not as good or better than the other organization, but it could potentially also be because that they are using other platforms that they believe in, and they haven't really fully adopted or they don't believe in the full optimization of SharePoint. That's fine. Optimization could mean different things for different organizations, but there is a baseline. And that's where I go back to the governance framework. Based on your business needs, there has to be a baseline. You cannot stay in the early stages because that is always a risk. So what is the holistic approach to this, right? And what we're talking about here is SharePoint, while it is a technology that is probably managed and administered, well, not probably, more times than not, it's going to be managed and administered by IT. It is a business platform to allow the various organizations to operate and be efficient and run their business within the company, right? The goals have to be aligned between IT and the business. This is where we see sometimes that failure of moving to the next stage is when the business needs something that IT is not willing to give them, or when IT wants to push something to the business that just doesn't accommodate the business because of their, let's say, restrictions, right? So there has to be alignment. This is where we see sometimes companies or organizations with their company move away from SharePoint. It's what we call shadow IT, right? There has to be alignment between the two. And governance allows for that alignment. Strategic support for mission and vision, right? That means every single organization within the company and the company as a whole, there has to be a strategy as to why we're using this platform and what is the benefit of this platform back to us. And also it's a very important part of this that goes back to shadow IT and it goes back to processes. Can this platform upend some other platform that we're spending money on? Because at the end of the day, if you're spending money on the SharePoint platform, you want to be able to understand what the ROI on that platform is, not only from a usage perspective, human users, but how can I also maybe sunset other platforms that are doing the same thing? And finally, obviously, what is the objective? What are we using it for? What is the end goal of using this platform? So align with both, right? We mentioned this. You're aligning with both business and IT. They have to be aligned. Businesses usually, when it comes to SharePoint, it's probably one of the most common platforms we've ever worked with, where it's literally the business heavily drives the usage of SharePoint and how it should be used and how it's designed and how it's built. Finally, and I'll talk about us a little bit about how we approach a governance framework exercise, right? If any of our customers ever approach us or partners and ask us for a governance framework because they are sold on that it's the right thing to do, and it is the right thing to do, this building block that you're looking at, and it doesn't necessarily have to be each and every title that you see here, but the general idea here is that IT cannot be the only representative in a committee. Every single organization must have a representative, and we actually list that in our statement of work. There has to be representation from various departments within the company in a committee that sits down, argues, debates, agrees, and disagrees on how the platform should be configured. And IT's function is twofold. It's for two reasons you want IT obviously in the committee. One is to also always translate what these different organizations want into the possibilities of the platform, right? There are certain things that maybe the sales manager wants that SharePoint cannot provide, right? If a sales manager comes in and says, I want SharePoint to act as my CRM, the answer is going to be, no, that's not going to happen. You need to go buy a separate CRM system, right? Uh, when marketing comes in and says, I want SharePoint to allow me to share files with my vendors, right, or with our partners, the answer should be yes, that it can do that, but that there might be a competing scenario by HR to say, wait a second, this is too risky. What happens if our HR stuff leaks? And this is where IT bridges the gap in a governance committee to say, we could potentially and possibly give you both what you need as long as we understand the need. And then we will structure, build, and design the platform the right way based on each and every need within this committee. So the bottom line is IT must relinquish this control of the platform, meaning I make the final decision of what the platform should look like, um, before consulting and listening to the requirements of the various businesses. And to listen to that, the various businesses have to be all speaking at the same time because of those potential competing interests within the platform that could put you at a risk, whether security or abandonment or adoption of the platform. And with that, I conclude and hand it back to Andreas for any questions.
Thank you, Joe. Joe, can you see my screen?
I can now.
All right. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. And before we jump to our Q&A section, I would like to share that all attendees to this webinar can benefit from a special promotion. As you can see on the screen, we're offering a discount on governance framework till the end of December. Please reach out to your provider or account executive for more details. I'll open the floor for Q&A. Please leverage the feature on the top toolbar. Joe, to give time a little bit for everybody to share their questions. SharePoint as a collaborative tool for everybody to be able to work together. We did talk about maturing it from a setup, making sure that we're well governed and all of that. Internally, we've started to go into phase 2 that I would like to share a little bit with everybody watching this webinar, which is how can we modernize with SharePoint and how can we integrate simpler ways for day-to-day use by using Power Platform. Can you give us a little idea about that? I know that we've dedicated another webinar that's strictly Power Platform, but within SharePoint maturity, at what stage do we actually talk about that and talk about investing that second level with SharePoint?
Yeah, yeah. So when we start talking about automation, you cannot even think through that when you're in the ad hoc stage. The automation will not work. It'll break because you are automating things that automation requires consistency, right? Think of it as a structure. Uh, Even though SharePoint is a platform for unstructured data, but there has to be structure around how you store that data. So when it comes to automation, you could completely just dismiss any potential for automation where you're in stage one, which is chaotic ad hoc stage. It's an exercise in futility. I strongly discourage it. You're wasting your time and you're wasting your money. You can introduce automation in the next stage, which is your organizational governance stage, which is when one organization in the company is governing their own like space. Remember the example I gave about the room in the house? You can introduce automation. The only problem with that is that that automation will always have to be quarantined and guardrailed to that room in the house, right? So all you're doing is you're improving upon efficiencies within that room in the house. But to realize the true power of automation, you have to have standardization and governance across the tenant, right? And then you could start disseminating automation, efficient automation across the whole organization. This is where I would call where you would see a return on investment. This is where at a CFO level, they could start seeing, hey, we used to have to do 20 things manually across the company. And now we only do 4 things manually because the other 16 are automated, right? So you could still realize, you could still get an ROI if you automate a certain task within the room in the house, but it's not gonna be, it's not gonna bubble up to the top and realize that ROI as if you had standardized across the whole platform.
Understood. Thank you. Our first question is, at a high level, what does a governance exercise look like and how long does it take?
So I'll answer this in a backwards. How long a governance exercise takes, obviously the duration is a little bit dependent on the participation, right? We will never go into a customer and just simply just dictate to them and walk away. We need their participation. We need them to talk to us about their business. We need a bit of knowledge transfer. There's a lot of tribal knowledge within the companies, people that have been there a long time or that are, champions or, high level people that we need their knowledge to understand how they run the business and how we can translate that to SharePoint. So duration wise, it could vary, right? Depending on the size of the company and depending on participation. Effort wise, the way we do it is we sell it almost like a product, which is we understand roughly from experience that a company with 100 employees will have four departments, 5 departments, which means that we need to collaborate and interface with 5 or 6 people in the committee, meaning the committee is going to be a certain size. And based on that size is how we sell the product or the framework. So we could definitely, if you want to know more about the pricing, you could definitely reach to your AE or your partner offline. But usually we would, suggest it's 2 weeks of effort for and please don't quote me because I don't have the numbers in front of me. But, if it's a 100 employee company, it's a 2 week effort. If it's 1,000 employee company, it's a 4 week effort, right? If it's 20,000 people, we have a different ball game, right? It's a long engagement because you have to get everybody involved. And finally, to answer what it looks like, so it's really, there are more experts. We have architects here that know way more about that, but I could speak at a high level what it looks like, which is one, identifying the governance committee. Without a committee, without a governing body, we can't get anywhere. So we need to get into the company and work with people that support us and going around the company and identifying the champions and the stakeholders to form the committee. That's one. Without that, we can't get going. That's like coming off the blocks. There are no blocks if you can't form a committee. The next step would be to literally schedule sessions with that committee over the duration of the engagement and start talking through the current processes, the current way that these organizations do business and run their business, right? And start innovating and identifying the areas with our SharePoint experts as how you could improve, how you could secure, and how you should improve and how you should secure a lot of those legacy processes or a lot of the inefficiencies that exist in the world today. We build that out together as a team. We deliver we also, our architects are also, I would like to call them educators. And the reason for that is because they more times than not are going to educate the customer on certain things and certain features and certain technologies within the SharePoint platform that they might have otherwise not known about.
I will give everybody a few minutes to send other questions. I wanted to ask you also about, at a certain level, SharePoint is a very complex tool. We talked about governance as a first step. When we go about bigger companies and talk about enterprise level, what is the maintenance exercise that needs to be done quarterly to make sure that SharePoint still is governed, or how does a follow-up look after governance?
Yeah. So when and we've been working on SharePoint for a very long time. It used to be simpler from the fact that back in the on-premises days, we knew that governance, there was a little more of a beat to governance. We knew that every time a new version of SharePoint released, we had to go back and revisit governance because new features are introduced in this new release. Oh, you have to worry about those. How do we address those? When it comes to SharePoint Online, which is the ever-evolving feature and innovation on the platform, we recommend that governance is revisited at a cadence, and we recommend that that cadence is no longer, that gap is no longer than 1 year. And a lot of times it should be a lot more times per year. So we're saying don't go more than 1 year without revisiting your governance framework. Why? One, a lot of things we talk about today, while could still be and will still be relevant in a year, but there's a lot of things that we didn't talk about today that are relevant in a year. Why? Because they didn't exist today. New features, new items introduced into the platform. Microsoft is continuously improving upon the platform. So we have to revisit those in a year because we didn't know they existed or they didn't exist today. That's one. Two, companies, most companies, you would think, and at least we know, they don't want to sit still. I mean, companies want to grow. Most companies want to grow. As companies grow, processes are introduced, complexities are introduced. Those complexities and those processes actually break some of the frameworks that were originally designed. So you have to come back and revisit. Or sometimes new companies, as they grow, they just simply introduce brand new greenfield processes. Those brand new greenfield processes have to be addressed. So we recommend 1 year. We have a number of customers that are a little larger than that are at a much faster growth pace, that will come back and want to revisit those frameworks once every 6 months, where we sit down. The governance updates aren't as exhaustive because you're really kind of looking at deltas. So at least you have a baseline. You look at your original framework and you go, okay, this is what we designed a year ago. These are the gaps based on your growth and based on the new technology that was introduced into SharePoint.
Especially with Copilot being released not long
That's
ago, that brings a lot of complexity within SharePoint.
That's a perfect example. Copilot is one of our biggest driver of governance today, which is either, hey, I don't have governance in place and yikes, I need it because I want Copilot, or I do have governance in place, but man, we definitely need to revisit it because Copilot is introducing a new paradigm, a huge paradigm shift. Are we ready for Copilot? And the answer usually is, first of all, let's look at your governance before we answer any of these questions.
The next question, I'm concerned about risk and compliance. What tips or additional recommendations do you have to help us work through this?
Yeah, this is so let me talk through this a little bit. I think it's important to identify the limitations of a governance framework, right? And I don't want to call it limitations. I want to call it the stages, right? We talk about maturity stages here. Let's talk about stages of governance and stages of those frameworks. We are going to any governance framework in the baseline governance framework, we are going to talk about risk and compliance. That is definitely a very important topic, and we will address it in every framework we get into. What's important, though, to differentiate is that risk and compliance is also its own beast, especially if you're in a very, very regulated industry. And we touch in our framework on the art of the possible when it comes to risk and compliance. We think of it as a POC, lightweight introduction into the possibilities and into the what you should do, right? But we have a couple of customers, healthcare and financial customers, that will come back to us and say, you just introduced us to something that we need to expand upon, which is policies and labeling and data loss prevention and rights management. And all of these are things that map back to our standards, to NIST, to ISO, to all of these regulations that we need to adhere to. We have one here, for example, for the judiciary system in Texas, right? They got requirements that are specific to them. We do that as a post-governance framework exercise, because that could potentially be a very, very intensive exercise, depending on the industry you're in.
All right. I believe that's all the questions we received. Thank you, Joe, for the wonderful presentation. I would like to mention to everybody watching that we'll be taking a break during December. So we wish you happy holidays and see you in 2025.
Thank you.